It's just maddening. I mean, especially for something that said it was about government efficiency. The State Department has one estimate that the cost of shutting down USAID was $6 billion. So instead of saving money, they've spent $6 billion killing a lot of kids.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. Delighted to welcome a New York Times columnist. His books include a memoir, Chasing Hope, published last year, two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He's also, more importantly, the general manager at Kristof Farms, which produces hard cider, Pinot Noir. I'm not a Pinot Noir man myself. Chardonnay and Rosé in the Willamette Valley. It's Nick Kristof. What's up?
Hey, well, I just can't believe you are starting off by admitting you're not a Pinot Noir fan. The best wine ever.
Yeah, I know. That movie Sideways made it very popular, and so I pretended to like it for a little while, and I just finally came around to admitting that I just don't. It's not for me.
You've got to keep on with the fakery. One of our family tales that I kind of won my wife over at a party by bringing her a Pinot Noir when everybody else was inflicting Cabernet Sauvignon on her.
Okay. Well, I'll have to check out your rosé, the Kristof rosé. That's really more.
It's an amazing rosé. It really is. And it's just so nice to have something to distract myself from all the mess in the world and in Washington.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your Oregon life at the end, but what prompted us to reach out, I so appreciate that you came on the pod, was, I don't know, maybe about a month ago now, Marco Rubio was testifying that your reporting about the impact of USAID cuts was a lie. You wrote a response column where you say, I see Secretary Rubio as a good man doing bad things. I thought that was a little generous, but we'll get into that. Yeah. And then you replied by telling him to meet Evan Anzu, who you met in Africa. So why don't we start by sharing Evan's story, and then we'll talk more broadly about your reporting.
Yeah, so I made a trip to South Sudan at the beginning of March to try to gauge the impact of USAID cuts. And at that point, Elon Musk had said that no one had died from those cuts. And, within an hour of beginning my reporting in South Sudan, I had the names of a bunch of people who had died, including kids. And so Evan Anzo was a little boy who was an AIDS orphan. His parents had died. And the only way he could access ARVs, antiretrovirals, was through a social worker who was paid by this program, PEPFAR, that George W. Bush had started. And so those intermediaries, those social workers were cut out. And how is a little boy going to access ARVs? He doesn't. And then he gets an opportunistic infection and dies. And, that happened to him. It happened to a boy called Peter Donde. It happened to a little girl called Ekal Deng. And it is happening to people all over the world.
Most probably talk to us about your reporting, because I'm just extremely interested, since you're on, I'm sitting in my hole here in New Orleans, shouting at the screen, but you're there. You've done several trips, so kind of talk about where you've gone and just at the broadest level.
So my first trip in March was to South Sudan and to some degree to Kenya. Kenya was a little less affected. South Sudan was brutally affected. And then just recently, I'm just back from a trip to West Africa, a follow-up trip where I was mostly in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And again, what you see everywhere is kids dying unnecessarily of really simple things, of malaria, of diarrhea, and indeed of HIV-related infections, of malnutrition. And you see women dying in childbirth. And, that is because USAID truly was flawed in some ways, but it was also saving 6 lives a minute as our best guess. And when you take that away, you get people dying. And I just wish that Marco Rubio, instead of denouncing my reporting, would come with me on a trip, and I'd be delighted to show him some of these kids who are starving. And I would like to think that would at least melt his heart.
Yeah. We'll get back to Rubio. I'm skeptical about that. It's a good instinct. I appreciate your instincts on that. So just help me paint a picture. So you're going, I wouldn't even know where to start, right? You go to Sierra Leone and what, the embassy help you? Are you're working with NGOs and what part of what are you looking at?
Normally I might drop in on an embassy to talk to officials there, but these days I kind of think I would get any ambassador in trouble, get him fired if I showed up in the embassy. So I, uh, so basically what I was doing was dropping in on villages. And so I dropped in on one village and I asked if there had been any children who
So
had
you have a
died.
translator or like?
Yeah, I had a translator, and we found a local health worker who had been kind of laid off in all this chaos, but he showed me around, and I asked if anybody had died in that village recently, and they said, "Oh, this little boy died." So we went and talked to the mom, and it turned out that he had had malaria. Normally the local health worker would have had the malaria treatment, the medicine, and also the hospital would have as backup because of the collapse of USAID. Neither of them had this really cheap malaria medicine, and the baby died. And now, as it turned out, that mom had she had her second child was also sick with malaria, and the hospital and the health workers still didn't have anti-malarials. And you just see this mom with a sick child and all these arguments that I hear about, oh, this isn't our responsibility and we should look after our own kids. This is a mom with a sick child. She's already lost one child because of the sudden way in which USAID was created. And she's gonna, she's at risk of losing another because of politics in Washington, because of decisions made in Washington by people who've, never been to places like this village.
Do folks there like understand what's happening? Like,
No,
that it's related to Washington, or like how?
so
They just
I
think medicine.
regularly ask people,
Yeah.
do you know who the president of the United States is? And, in the villages, most people did not know. Some of them had heard of Trump if you mentioned it. They were sometimes aware of USAID and sometimes aware that USAID had, you know, that there had been big problems with it. They were aware that medicine was less available. I visited one village again, just kind of I just went with some health workers off into the mountains, and I heard of a woman who had died in childbirth. And so we went to the village. We found her dad and her sister, and she had hemorrhaged in April. And there had been a hospital donated by USAID 2 years ago for that kind of eventuality. And so they called the ambulance, and the ambulance crew said, well, the funding has been cut for fuel for our ambulance. And so if you bring us fuel, we can go rescue this woman, Yama Freeman. But, that's not going to happen. And so a bunch of, she's badly hemorrhaging, and a bunch of the strongest young men in the village, they put her in a hammock and put her on their shoulders, and they ran down this red mud path 10 miles toward the hospital, shouting encouragement to her as they go, keep on going, Yama. And she dies en route for want of fuel for an ambulance that we had already donated.
Just like a fucking comedy of errors, and that's so sad. So are things like, there's some, I guess, conversation that things are that like they have uncanceled some of this stuff. So you were there most recently. Like, help me sort through that. Like, what is
Yeah.
still, what is still part of the Doge cuts? What have they, put back into place?
So that is true that some things have been uncanceled. The problem is it's very hard to figure out what is being uncanceled. And it was this quite complicated system where you had different groups doing different things. So one group would supply the ARVs, another would provide the health workers who uh, who 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 administer them. Another would look after the supplies in a warehouse. Somebody else would coordinate among the different NGOs.
Sure.
Somebody else would do viral load checking, and this all kind of collapses. So some elements have been preserved, but they often don't work together with the other elements. And so some malaria programs are coming back, for example, but the malaria medicine in one county in Liberia, it was being stored in this medical warehouse that the county had, and USAID had they had contracted to upgrade the warehouse, and they started the work, and the roof was torn off, and then that's when the stop work order went out. So now the medical warehouse has no roof. So, okay, in theory, they're providing malaria medicine again, but all of a sudden there's no roof on the medical warehouse. And, it's just things like this that you hear over and over and over. And it's just maddening. I mean, especially for something that said it was about government efficiency, to see the toll of the inefficiency. The State Department has one estimate that the cost of shutting down USAID was $6 billion. So instead of saving money, they've spent $6 billion killing a lot of kids.
So getting to see how that process works, I wonder how you respond to, I've seen Elon has done a little bit of and JD, I guess actually this was JD, not Elon, but Elon has said this. JD was repeating something Elon had said. He was on Theo Vaughn's podcast. Theo was asking him about, the USAID and these horror stories. And JD kind of confidently says, well, did you know that only $1 in $10 or whatever, I forget the exact number, $3 in $100 that went to USAID was actually going to help people. And the rest of it was all grift, and it was, people skimming off the top, and these NGOs, these folks are getting rich. Like, how would you respond to that, like, criticism, having seen it all on the ground?
So I think there's something to the critique that too much money was going to the contractors in the Beltway, I mean, the Beltway bandits, as they're called. I think there's something to that critique. There have been efforts to have more money go, but I mean the real reason so much of the money isn't being handed directly to people on the ground is that it's going, say, to buy vaccines. So I mean, one of the most life-saving efforts is called Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. It has saved 18 million lives so far. And, it is this very efficient international body that is buying vaccines for malaria, for HPV to prevent cervical cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's not going to help to give somebody in Liberia $5 and tell them to go buy their vaccines. You have to coordinate. The same with the Global Fund against AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. That there are some things that are more efficient when the money is spent in a global way. And but I mean, was there room to reform USAID? Absolutely. Was it too bureaucratic? Totally. PEPFAR, I think, sometimes spent more than it needed to on some kinds of salaries in a way that disrupted the ecosystem. Could that have been spent more efficiently? Yeah, but what we got wasn't a reform; it was demolition.
Yeah, and when you're talking about waste, also, I've in some of your columns you wrote there are two things that struck me just about the current waste that's now happening in the reform system, which is there was something called plumpy nut. I guess we've already manufactured here in America, which is now not getting to people. And then there are the Merck medicines. Talk about those examples.
So the plumpy nut is this miracle peanut paste that over the last 20 years or so has been developed. And it just brings severely acutely malnourished children back to life. It's incredible to see how effective it is. And it is one reason why malnutrition mortality has come down a great deal. So right now, a child is dying of malnutrition about every 15 seconds. And meanwhile, the U.S. taxpayers have already purchased 185,000 boxes of plumpy nut that taxpayers own, that is sitting in a warehouse in Rhode Island gathering dust because the State Department, given the collapse of USAID, doesn't really know what to do with it. And
so it's manufactured here.
It's manufactured in the U.S.
creating jobs here. We've already paid for it.
Exactly.
And it's already been produced. It's sitting in a warehouse in Rhode Island doing nothing.
That's correct. And there's another 500,000 boxes in Georgia in a kind of similar situation. There are two manufacturers in the U.S., one in Rhode Island, one in Georgia. And this is just, I mean,
You think
talk
the
about
richest man in the
waste.
world could figure out how to get that to Africa, if it wasn't for if he didn't want USAID to do it because the communists were in USAID or whatever, you think he could figure out how to get the boxes to Sierra
And it's,
Leone?
yeah, I mean, and it's inefficiency, but it's inefficiency that is killing kids.
Yeah.
And, it just, I can't tell you how heartbreaking it is to see a child with severe malnutrition. Um, and I think that's because they don't cry. They don't show pain. They don't show any expression. They barely turn their heads. They're basically, the body is saving every calorie it can just to keep the major organs functioning. And they look a little like zombies, and their eyes follow you, but they're so expressionless, and it just breaks your heart. And meanwhile, we've paid for the plumpy net to save their lives. And then, as you suggest, there's something similar that I went to a warehouse in Sierra Leone, in a gated compound. The security guard let me into the warehouse, and there is enough medicine for to prevent river blindness, this terrible scourge of blindness. Enough medicine to help 7 million people in Sierra Leone. It's donated by Merck. Merck then shipped it to Sierra Leone.
So we didn't even pay for this.
We didn't even pay for this.
Yeah.
Every dollar, and basically the U.S. just has to pay for distribution, and every dollar in this is called mass drug administration. Every dollar in mass drug administration leverages $26 in donated drugs. It's there. And now, but the U.S. canceled the drug administration, and so it's sitting there gathering dust, and and some of it is approaching expiration dates. When it expires, the destruction of these drugs will be expensive. It's just this nightmare.
What is river blindness that the drug prevents?
River blindness, it's a disease it's a parasitic disease where the parasites go behind the eye and they destroy the optic nerve, and it is painful. It means that very large areas can no longer be farmed. People have to flee. And it's been one of the great successes, partly because of Jimmy Carter. They discovered that this deworming medicine, ivermectin, can control river blindness, can prevent it. And Merck has been donating, I forget how many doses of this for years now. And so,
wait,
more
it's
than
ivermectin?
Ivermectin.
Is the
Yeah,
drug?
it's the same.
The miracle drug that the MAGA people thought cure COVID and everything?
Yeah. And but ivermectin doesn't work on COVID. Boy, it works with river blindness. And it's an incredibly effective drug.
Can't we use that propaganda? You know how great ivermectin is. We want to bring it to the people of Sierra Leone. It's just wasting away.
The paradox is that Merck makes money on ivermectin largely to deworm American pets. When you deworm a dog or a horse in the U.S., it's with ivermectin, and then they use those supply lines to producing ivermectin. To provide free ivermectin. It's the brand name Mectizan to Africa to wipe out river blindness. River blindness has come down more than 90%. Jimmy Carter gets a special shout out. He was heroic in focusing attention on this. It's been one of the great public health successes of the last 25 years. Yeah. And now,
so it's weird. It's such like that public health success and the great public health success of the Bush administration with PEPFAR just being totally just axed for nothing, essentially.
Yeah, they were. It's a measure of whether it's PEPFAR under President Bush or the river blindness or the strides against polio, against leprosy. One doesn't hear about leprosy anymore. That's because it's gone down about 97% or something. There really have been huge strides, and now again they're in doubt.
All right. Well, you and I could not be more aligned on this. I mean, I guess you're doing the Lord's work while I'm just sitting here, but it's hard for me to come up with challenging questions to you. But luckily, you posted an article recently where some of your readers were upset with you, and so I want to go through a couple of those questions. But before we get to the readers, here was Rubio's response when you asked Rubio to do an interview about these accusations that you are lying. He cowardly declined to do that. He then provided a written statement and said, America is already the most generous nation in the world. We urge other nations to dramatically increase their humanitarian efforts. If you had the chance to talk to him, what would you have said to him about that?
Well, I'd point out that it is true that the U.S. donates more than any other single country. I mean, the U.S. donates more than Luxembourg or Liechtenstein. We're a big country. Per capita, we donate rather less than the average member of the OECD, for example. And we donate 0.24% of GDP. Norway donates more than 1%. And I'd also note that when the U.S. slashed aid, that also created a permission structure in which other countries promptly followed suit. So instead of spurring other countries to do better, it actually led them to cut aid themselves. So Britain cut aid, France cut aid, Netherlands cut aid, I think Belgium cut aid. And the result is this perfect storm in places like South Sudan or Liberia or Sierra Leone or Eastern Congo, where kids are dying and women are dying in childbirth.
It's hard to be like, it's not actually crazy for the New York Times columnist to say to the Secretary of State, let's talk about this. Or let's travel to Africa. And it is his job. I know he has like 4 jobs. He's also the archivist, and he's kidnapping students based on their op-eds and stuff. But like, if he truly believed in this policy, that this was inefficient, that we could do better, the Secretary of State, many Secretary of States have gone to Africa, visited Africa, talked about, met with locals. It's notable that is not part of this program at all.
No, I mean, Rubio is interesting because he's a smart guy. He's well informed. And historically, we know that he has been a champion of USAID, I think both for humanitarian reasons, but especially for the projection of soft power, for the way that it is a way of dealing with China. And, since being appointed Secretary of State, that has just completely collapsed. And now he's just an echo chamber for Donald Trump. And, that's what ambition does to you. And it's really sad to watch.
Have any of the high-ranking Trump officials gone to the countries that were receiving USAID that you are familiar with?
I can't think of any.
Yeah, me neither. All right. I want to, some of the other arguments you got from readers, there are, and this is kind of related to what Marco just said, but what do you say to the more good faith arguments about America first? That like, we have a lot of problems here. There are hungry kids here. We just don't have the resources for this. It's not about, the fact that we're black-hearted or whatever. It's just, we got to do the best we can. We got to take care of people here. What do you say to that?
So, I mean, it's a fair point. I think we do have real needs at home. And when I write my tiny little checks at the end of the year, I have to weigh things I care about abroad against needs at home. I make the point, though, in trying to weigh those in my own mind, both for my giving and for government policy, I'd note that the needs abroad are simply vastly greater than those at home. And that it is far cheaper to save a life abroad than at home. Like I mentioned, that woman whose baby had died of malaria. So when the hospital didn't have the drug, she could have gone out to a pharmacy and purchased it. It would have been about $20. And she scrambled and she could not find $20 in time. $20 can save a life abroad. The ARVs to save a little child like Evan Anzo, who we talked about earlier, that costs about 12 cents a day. You cannot save lives with that kind of money at home. And also, I think that there's a danger with the American First argument that it becomes a complete lack of compassion for people of different skin color or different passport color. And, it was also true in the 1930s, 1940s that we had real problems at home, real inequities at home. Yet clearly we should have done more to bring in Jewish immigrants from Europe, for example, instead of turning them away. And so yes, there are trade-offs. Yes, I don't I don't have any perfect algorithm for how much we spend abroad versus how much at home. But fundamentally, I don't think that not spending 12 cents a day to keep a child alive in South Sudan is going to mean that fewer kids in the U.S. are going to be living and thriving here.
Yeah. I guess the thing I'd add to that is it's not just, and you mentioned the 0.2 or 0.02 of GDP or whatever, but the tangible example I always bring up is in Trump's first term, 2019, the tariffs caused all this disruption in the agriculture industry. And so we did a bailout of farmers. And that farmer bailout cost basically the cost of USAID. Like it's essentially equivalent of the entire program, right? And that's just one thing that we did that people barely even remember, like internally. I think you mentioned the example of the Yemen bombings recently, which cost.
Yeah, I mean, we spent $7 billion bombing Yemen since the fall of 2023. $7 billion. And, you think about what that could have done, how many kids' lives that would have saved around the world. And we didn't even notice the Yemen bombing. And it didn't really achieve anything. And, we could have done so much good with that money. You think about we can afford a parade and a military parade in Washington, but we can't afford to keep so alive. Really?
Yeah. You're turning me into a bleeding heart lib here, Kristof. We're going to get to some Democratic stuff at the end. Just a couple of these other pushback arguments really quick. This one is vaguely compelling to, I think, if you don't really know what's happened around the world, but I understand why this would be a compelling argument to people. But we've been pouring tens of billions of dollars into other countries for many decades and nothing changes. We don't have any results. So, what obviously this is not a valuable program.
So let me push back. I'd say that the most extraordinary thing happening in the world over the last 50 years has been incredible progress against global poverty. And so, for example, in 1950, 27% of children died before the age of 5. Now we're down to just under 4% of children. It's incredible progress. When I was a kid, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate throughout human history. Now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. When I graduated from college,
that's about to go back down thanks to AI and TikTok. But we're doing all right.
Yeah, absolutely. But I made my first trip through Africa in 1982, and just the comparison today in terms of less leprosy, less river blindness, less extreme poverty, fewer people dying of malaria. It's just staggering.
The last pushback you got, which it was like, reminded me of my the new liberal cultural milieu I'm swimming in now, because I didn't hear this argument before from very many people, but it's the lefty degrowther argument, which was essentially, as you put it, providing food aid may seem merciful, but it's just going to lead to population increases and more people starving down the road. We need family planning and fewer children in Africa. I'm like, I could not like that. I'm physically repulsed by that argument, but I understand that people have it. So I would like to hear what you think of that.
So, I mean, that's very much a Thomas Malthus argument that, it's wrong. So the reason people have a lot of children is because they think that many children will die. And so if you help keep those kids alive, they have fewer children. And you see that around the world. I mean, India used to be the kind of the center of the Malthusian nightmares. And now the total fertility rate, the number of women an Indian woman will have over her lifetime is 2.0. That's less than replacement level, which is 2.1. And so, absolutely, we need to support family planning and give women control over the number of children they will have. There are 300 million women worldwide who need support with modern family planning, and we can help them with that. But that should not come at the expense of keeping their babies alive. I mean, that's just grotesque.
Indeed. Okay. I want to go to El Salvador. It's just the worst horror that we're inflicting on people, I think, in this administration. It's a competitive category, but you wrote about El Salvador, but you started the column with a story about your father, who had been disappeared, and how he was eventually released thanks to the advocacy of a French diplomat, Robert Morisset.
Yeah.
And you talked about how the lesson of that. So maybe just share that story a little bit.
So my dad's family, they were Armenians in Eastern Europe, and they spied on the Nazis during World War II. They got caught. Some of the family members were killed by the Nazis. Others were executed by the Soviets. My dad fled and was in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia. And then this French diplomat, Robert Morisset, who had nothing to gain. It wasn't really his job to worry about. My dad was a Romanian citizen, about Romanians and Yugoslavian prison camps, but he did, and my dad was spared. Then my dad got to France, and then a Presbyterian church in Portland, Oregon, sponsored his way to come to the U.S. It wasn't clear my dad was going to get a visa, and two French journalists spoke up for my dad, and he was able to get the visa. And again, should journalists really be suggesting to an American ambassador to give somebody a visa? Not clear, but I exist because all these people did things that were kind of at the edge. And so I contrast that compassion and empathy that was directed at my dad, that was completely transformative, with the, I don't know what the opposite of empathy is, but just the gratuitous cruelty that has been directed at so many people today, whether it's, AIDS orphans in South Sudan, whether it's immigrants here. And, absolutely we need to control our borders. Absolutely there are difficult trade-offs that need to be made. But just grabbing people off the street and shipping them to a brutal prison in El Salvador, I mean, that's just going out of your way to be cruel and heartless.
Yeah, merciless. It's horrific what they're doing, and I appreciated the story because it spoke to the element of, like, I think that sometimes there's a hopelessness that people feel about this sort of thing. Like, this is just not something that is resolvable at this point, right? Like that they can have legal remedies and all that, but the story shows that it's not like quite right? Like that by drawing attention to this sort of stuff, by pressuring them, like despite the fact that many of the people executing this policy are cruel and depraved and kind of heartless and don't really care that much about the lives of the Venezuelans that have been sent to El Salvador, they still don't like negative PR. And Bukele still is going to have to deal with the world after Trump. That'll happen at some point, right? Like there are contingencies, like there are ways to do this. And the story of your dad, I think, highlights. To me, I read it as like bucking people up to try and not to have a learned helplessness.
One thing I often hear from people is that the problems are so vast that anything I do is only going to be a drop in the bucket. And, in a sense, that is true. There are, so many, there are close to 5 million kids a year who die somewhere around the world under the age of 5. And, that's heartbreaking. We're not going to solve that. But it is pretty easy to save some of those lives really cheaply. Yeah. And yes, that's a drop in the bucket in a sense. But, my dad was a drop in the bucket. And Robert Morisset, he changed a drop in the bucket in the form of my dad, and the First Presbyterian Church in Portland, Oregon, did the same. And I exist because of those drops in the bucket. Drops in the bucket, that is how you fill buckets. And it doesn't doesn't change the overall trend, but boy, it's meaningful and it's powerful to save individual lives and transform those trajectories.
Do you have any thoughts on edge case examples of what people could do about the El Salvador situation in particular? And when I talk to Democratic politicians, part of me is like, shouldn't Democrats and European countries and stuff start to threaten El Salvador and say that you're going to be treated like Venezuela and North Korea if you continue this? I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts on dealing with the disappearings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Bukele he cares about his image. He puts a great deal of emphasis on his image. He's very popular within El Salvador because while he's been brutal, he has also, vastly improved the security situation.
Yeah, quality of life has improved in El Salvador.
Yeah, and so, but he cares about his national image.
If you're not wrongly jailed into the RoboCop exactly. prison, but for everybody else, the quality of life is improved. Yeah.
And so, I think by the power of embarrassing leaders like that, I think that really counts. And I've seen how when you write letters about a political prisoner, then sometimes they don't do any good. Miraculously, sometimes they do lead somebody to be released. Kim Dae-jung was the South Korean dissident. He was almost executed, and he was a thorn in the in the side of the South Korean officials. But they did spare his life under pressure. They eventually released him under pressure, and then I watched as he became South Korea's president. There are vulnerabilities. One can imperfectly have real effect on improving human rights.
All right, let's talk about the Democrats for a second. You thought about leaving your perch as a scribe and farmer and to run for office there in Oregon. That didn't take off for a variety of reasons, but just through that experience, and since that happened, obviously Trump has won again. Like, what's your assessment of? Like, what do you think you had to offer? Like, what's your assessment of what the Democratic Party is not offering right now? What are the gaps in your estimation?
So I guess I'd mention a couple of gaps, and certainly there are many Democrats who are very aware of this. I'm not bringing something dramatically new to the picture, but I'm very aware of the challenges in working class America, partly because my hometown here, Yamhill, Oregon, is very much a working class community. And the traditional employers were agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing. Those jobs went away, and meth arrived. And at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And it has been devastating to watch. And people feel betrayed by what they perceive as elites, and they have a point. We've lost more than 1 million people since 2000 through overdoses, and we have not had a policy that is remotely as serious as that problem. I think there is a problem with condescension toward working class Americans, and so I would like to see some Democrats are good at not talking down. Robert Kennedy, they're not RFK Jr., but the original. He was brilliant at despite his privileged background at really listening to and communicating with working class Americans. And
you have Marie Gluesenkamp Perez up there in Washington,
yes,
not Oregon, but the Pacific Northwest.
Absolutely, right across the border.
Kind of jump to your mind.
Totally, and it's talking about. Not so much about these 30,000 foot levels about democracy. It's talking about just the daily issues that people are struggling with. And so I think the Democrats have to do a better job of that. And also, we just have to do a better job fixing our blue parts of the country. And that's particularly true in the West Coast and, these days in Chicago. We are great at saying that, housing is a human right. But we do a really bad job of addressing homelessness on the West Coast, California and Oregon in particular. And we, we deeply believe in education, and yet education outcomes in Oregon, for example, are near the bottom of the country. And, we've got to do a better job addressing our governance in our own places, partly because, we care about governance, and partly because we unfortunately become a talking point for Republicans in Wisconsin, Ohio, Georgia, et cetera, when we screw up.
How you mentioned the housing thing. I think about Oregon. There's this map. AEI put out this map. It's like a county map of where there's housing shortages is throughout the country, and it's like most of Oregon is on the map, like towards the higher end, like 10% housing shortage, significant. I wonder how much of that is running into environmentalism. Do you think? We did the Malthusian stuff earlier. How is that the issue, or is it red tape stuff, or is it lack of, like, what do you attribute that to?
So, my read, I've been persuaded by the evidence that it's basically that we're not producing enough housing, and that as a result, housing is expensive. When people have looked at, does homelessness correlate to addiction? Does it correlate to poverty? No. What really correlates to is high rents and difficulty in producing new housing shortages. So,
but why do you think Oregon's not producing new housing? In San Francisco, I get it. You have limited land and all that. Like, Oregon's got plenty of space. It's not like Oregon's overcrowded. Why isn't Oregon building enough housing, do you think?
So it has been, in many ways, an issue of regulation. We are very proud of our land use laws, which we pioneered in the 1970s, and they have preserved wild spaces. We don't have a big sprawl problem in Oregon, but it is a lot more costly to put up new housing in Oregon. So Vancouver, Washington, just right across the border from Portland, and an average home in Vancouver, on the Vancouver side, is about $100,000 less than a similar home on the Portland side. And rents, I think people associate addiction with homelessness because obviously you look out in the street, and those who are struggling tend to be those with mental health problems with addiction, and that's all real. But partly it's simply if you don't have enough housing, the people who aren't competent enough to get it and don't have the money to get it are those with various other problems. Issues, and so we focused very much on preventing evictions. But if you're short 170,000 housing units, then that's the basic structural problem. And just things like making it easier to have basement apartments, to have rooming houses. We used to have solutions to homelessness, like trailer parks and rooming houses, boarding houses, and then we zoned them out of the way and got rid of them.
All right, well, it's been good. What is being the general manager of a farm mean? Are you out there picking grapes, or what were this morning before you came on? Was your hands in the dirt?
This morning, before I came on, I ran through the vineyard. I'm not sure if that counts.
Okay.
My morning run is around there. So this is the family farm where I grew up. Actually, right now I'm in the house where I grew up. And we, part of it was we were just my wife and I were trying to figure out how we could address some of the problems that I was writing about, this lack of good jobs in the area. And so we think our role is principally advocacy, but we thought, well, if we can, we used to have a cherry orchard. If we can maybe do something that adds a little more agricultural value, then that'll be good for the community, maybe help with some tourism. And so we got the kids to, pledge their commitment. And so we started this family wine and cider business. And everything that could go wrong did. We put a impregnable deer fence around our vineyard and apple orchard, and then after we'd finished it, enormous expense and trouble, it turned out that we had imprisoned some deer inside our impregnable deer fence with nothing to eat but grapevines and apple trees. And, so plenty has gone wrong, but we have managed to produce, I think, some award-winning ciders, some wines that have very much impressed the wine critics, and it's and I've got to say,
sounds like the answer is and some jobs, because you're not out there picking the grapes,
and some jobs, and and it's been good for me. I think also because as a liberal columnist, I rarely meet a regulation I don't like. And all of a sudden, as a small business owner, I'm regularly outraged at this or that effort to regulate me. And so it's just good to see the world through a different prism sometimes. And if people if they want some great Chardonnay, Rosé, or Pinot Noir, they should check out KristofFarms.com.
All right. Well, I'm glad we're radicalizing you to the cutting red tape, neoliberal abundance agenda. All right. Last thing. Since you're there, people are like, what groups are still doing good work in Africa that I could donate to or support? Do you have any suggestions on that front?
Absolutely. So on this trip, the groups I've been suggesting are Helen Keller International, which does a lot of work on blindness and nutrition. And they were the ones who were supposed to be, who would have distributed this river blindness drug. And if they can raise enough money, it still will be distributed. And then, so that's one option. I mentioned deworming. There's a group called Deworm the World, which very efficiently deworms kids. And, this is so cheap to do. You can deworm a kid for about $1 a year. They stay in school more. They do better. And this malnutrition, this miracle pace plumpy nut. So the two organizations in the U.S. that make it and that can send it abroad, they're both nonprofits I recommend. One is Edesia Nutrition. That's Edesia Nutrition in Rhode Island. And the other is Mana Nutrition, MANA, Mana Nutrition in Georgia. And so that's what, those are some sort of three great options: Helen Keller International, Deworm the World, and either Edesia or Mana Nutrition for this peanut paste.
Great. Well, I will contribute and we'll put the links in the show notes. And I really appreciate the work you've been doing. And let's stay in touch.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks for the conversation. It was fun.
Thanks so much, Nick.
We got to get you on Pinot Noir, though.
Not going to happen, baby. I'm going to try out that Kristof Rosé.